James Harper had always been a dreamer. From the time he was a kid, he would sit in his room flipping through car magazines, staring at glossy pictures of sleek, roaring machines that seemed to leap off the page. To him, cars weren't just vehicles. They were works of art, symbols of freedom and proof that hard work could turn even the wildest dreams into reality. And now, after years of grinding away at his job as a software engineer, James finally stood on the brink of making one of those dreams come true. It all started when James got promoted at work. The raise wasn't just substantial, it was life-changing. For the first time ever, he had enough money to indulge in something truly extravagant. He didn't want to waste it on vacations or fancy clothes. No, what James wanted was far more meaningful: a supercar. Not just any supercar, but the crown jewel of modern engineering, the Lamborghini Huracan. The day James walked into the dealership felt surreal. His heart pounded as he stepped onto the showroom floor, surrounded by gleaming exotics that looked like they belonged on a racetrack rather than suburban streets. But nothing compared to the moment he laid eyes on his car, a fiery red Lamborghini Huracan. Its curves sharp yet elegant, its engine growling softly beneath the hood. It was love at first sight. After signing the paperwork, James couldn't stop smiling. This wasn't just a purchase, it was a milestone. Every late-night coding, every skipped vacation, every sacrifice he'd made over the years led to this moment. When James brought the Lamborghini home, he couldn't wait to show it off. He lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where everyone knew each other. At least that's how it seemed on the surface. The houses were tidy, the lawns manicured, and the streets lined with family sedans and minivans. Parking his new ride in the driveway felt like planting a flag. Sure, his neighbors might not understand why someone would spend so much money on a car, but James figured they'd appreciate its beauty. How could anyone resist admiring such a masterpiece? At first, reactions were mixed. Some neighbors stopped to gawk, snapping photos and asking questions about the horsepower and top speed. Kids gathered around wide-eyed and whispering excitedly. Even a few adults complimented James on his taste, calling the car stunning and impressive. For a while, everything seemed perfect. James felt like he was living the dream, cruising down tree-lined streets in his Italian marvel, basking in the envy and occasional admiration of those around him. But not everyone shared James's excitement. Enter Karen Miller, the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood's harmony. If there was one thing Karen loved more than enforcing rules, it was being the center of attention. As head of the Homeowners Association, HOA, she prided herself on keeping things orderly. Her vision of perfection included matching mailboxes, freshly painted fences, and zero tolerance for anything or anyone that disrupted the status quo. To Karen, James's flashy new addition represented chaos incarnate. Karen wasted no time voicing her disapproval. Within days of the Lamborghini's arrival, James found an official letter from the HOA taped to his front door. The message was clear: remove the eyesore from public view immediately. According to Karen's interpretation of the HOA guidelines, no vehicle valued above $50,000 could remain parked outside overnight. James read the letter twice, shaking his head in disbelief. Was this really happening? A Lamborghini, an icon of luxury and performance, labeled an eyesore? He laughed it off at first, assuming it was some kind of joke or misunderstanding. Surely Karen wouldn't take things further. Boy, was he wrong. Over the next few weeks, Karen made her feelings abundantly clear. She left passive-aggressive notes tucked under James's windshield wiper, criticizing everything from the car's color to its alleged noise pollution. At monthly HOA meetings, she ranted about how James's refusal to comply undermined the community's values. Each complaint was delivered with theatrical flair, complete as dramatic sighs and pointed glances at anyone daring to disagree. To Karen, this wasn't just about aesthetics or rules. It was personal. James's defiance struck at the very core of her authority, challenging her carefully constructed kingdom of conformity. Despite the growing tension, James tried to stay calm. He reasoned that most people probably thought Karen was overreacting. After all, plenty of neighbors still waved hello and complimented his car. Why let one person ruin his joy? So, he ignored the letters and notes, hoping Karen would eventually lose interest. What he didn't realize was that Karen thrived on resistance. The more James refused to back down, the more determined she became to assert control. Little did James know this was only the beginning of a feud that would spiral far beyond petty grievances. In Karen's mind, James's Lamborghini wasn't just a car. It was a declaration of war, and Karen wasn't about to surrender without a fight. The clash between James and Karen escalated quickly, turning what should have been a peaceful suburban existence into a daily battle of wills. At first, James tried to brush off Karen's complaints as harmless nonsense, just another example of her overzealous need to micromanage the neighborhood. But Karen wasn't the type to let things slide. She saw James's refusal to comply with her demands as an outright challenge to her authority, and she was determined to make him pay for it. It started with small annoyances. After sending the initial letter demanding that James move his Lamborghini into the garage, Karen began leaving passive-aggressive notes on his windshield. The messages ranged from sarcastic jabs about loud engines disturbing the peace to thinly veiled threats about potential fines if he didn't follow the HOA rules. One note read, "Dear neighbor, I hope you're enjoying your new toy. Just a friendly reminder that not everyone shares your unique taste." Each note was signed with Karen's name, underlined twice for emphasis. James found these notes amusing at first. He showed them to his friends, who laughed at how petty they seemed. But as the weeks went by, the frequency of the notes increased and their tone grew sharper. It became clear that Karen wasn't going to stop anytime soon. Her actions weren't just annoying, they were starting to feel invasive. James began wondering if she'd ever tire of this game or if she planned to keep pushing until she got her way. When ignoring her failed to deter her, Karen took things to the next level. During one of the monthly HOA meetings, she launched into a lengthy tirade about James's car. Standing in front of a room full of neighbors, she described the Lamborghini as a disruption to the community aesthetic and accused James of flaunting his wealth in a way that made others uncomfortable. She even went so far as to suggest that its presence might lower property values, a claim she couldn't back up with any evidence, but delivered with such conviction that some attendees nodded along. James, who had decided to attend the meeting, out of curiosity, listened in stunned silence as Karen painted him as the villain of the story. When it was finally his turn to speak, he calmly explained that his car was legally parked, posed no threat to anyone, and fell well within the bounds of acceptable behavior. He pointed out that many other residents owned expensive vehicles, including luxury SUVs and sports cars, none of which had drawn similar scrutiny. "If we're talking about rules," he added, "maybe we should focus on enforcing ones that actually matter, like keeping sidewalks clear or addressing real safety concerns." His words earned a few murmurs of agreement from the crowd, but Karen wasn't swayed. Instead of engaging in a rational discussion, she doubled down, accusing James of being disrespectful and dismissive of the HOA's efforts to maintain order. By the end of the meeting, it was painfully obvious that Karen wasn't interested in compromise. To her, this was personal. James's decision to stand his ground had ignited a firestorm of resentment, and she wasn't about to back down. As the days turned into weeks, Karen's campaign against James intensified. She started documenting every minor infraction she could pin on him, no matter how trivial. If a visitor parked near his house for longer than usual, Karen filed a complaint claiming it caused congestion. If James's lawnmower sat out for an extra day, she reported it as a violation of the HOA's landscaping guidelines. Even the color of his front door, which hadn't changed in years, suddenly came under scrutiny, with Karen insisting it clashed with the neighborhood palate. James tried to stay patient, reminding himself that most of his neighbors likely thought Karen was overreacting. Still, the constant barrage of complaints wore on him. Every time he opened his mailbox, he braced himself for yet another official-looking envelope containing some new accusation or demand. It felt like living in a never-ending episode of a bad sitcom, where the same character kept popping up to ruin everything. What made matters worse was Karen's knack for drama. She didn't just file complaints quietly behind closed doors. She made sure everyone knew exactly what she was doing. Whether it was loudly discussing James's issues during casual conversations with neighbors or posting vague updates on social media about maintaining standards, Karen ensured that her grievances remained front and center. Some residents sympathized with her, agreeing that James's car was too flashy for the neighborhood. Others rolled their eyes, dismissing her antics as typical Karen behavior. Either way, the tension simmered just below the surface, threatening to boil over at any moment. Despite the mounting pressure, James refused to give in. Moving the Lamborghini into the garage overnight would mean conceding defeat, and he wasn't willing to let Karen win. Besides, he reasoned, why should he have to hide something he worked so hard for? The car represented more than just a material possession. It symbolized freedom, ambition, and the culmination of years of sacrifice. Giving in to Karen's demands would feel like letting her control his life, and James wasn't about to let that happen. But Karen's persistence began to take its toll. Late one evening, after receiving yet another notice from the HOA, James sat on his porch staring at the Lamborghini in his driveway. For the first time, he questioned whether owning the car was worth all the trouble it was causing. Was it really worth enduring Karen's endless harassment and risking conflict with the entire neighborhood? As much as he loved the car, part of him wondered if he'd made a mistake bringing it home in the first place. Unbeknownst to James, however, Karen's vendetta was far from over. Her frustration reached a boiling point when she realized that her tactics weren't working. No amount of letters, notes, or public shaming had convinced James to budge. In her mind, there was only one option left: drastic action. And when Karen set her mind to something, she stopped at nothing to achieve it. Little did James know, the worst was yet to come. What started as a war of words was about to escalate into something far more destructive and irreversible. As the weeks dragged on, Karen's obsession with James's Lamborghini only grew stronger. Her frustration reached a fever pitch when she realized that her letters, complaints, and public shaming weren't having the desired effect. James remained steadfast, refusing to cave to her demands or hide his prized possession in the garage. To Karen, this wasn't just about enforcing HOA rules anymore. It was personal. Every time she looked out her window and saw that gleaming red supercar sitting proudly in James's driveway, it felt like a direct insult to her authority. She began to see herself as the last line of defense for the neighborhood's peace and order, and James as the villain who threatened everything she held dear. Karen's thoughts spiraled into darker territory. In her mind, James's defiance wasn't just inconvenient. It was dangerous. If she let him get away with breaking the rules, what message would that send to everyone else? Would other neighbors start flaunting their wealth too? Would property values plummet because people suddenly thought they could do whatever they wanted? These questions consumed her, fueling her determination to take matters into her own hands. After all, if the HOA couldn't make James comply, maybe she could. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the neighborhood fell into its usual quiet rhythm, Karen decided it was time to escalate things. She had been watching James closely, noting his routines and habits. He often left the house early in the morning for work and returned late at night, which meant his precious Lamborghini usually sat unattended in the driveway for hours. The idea formed slowly at first, a flicker of anger turning into a plan, but once it took root, there was no stopping her. That night, under the cover of darkness, Karen grabbed her car keys and slipped out of her house. Dressed in sweatpants and a hoodie to avoid drawing attention, she crept across the cul-de-sac toward James's driveway. Her heart raced as she approached the Lamborghini, its glossy surface reflecting the dim glow of the streetlights. Up close, the car was even more imposing than she'd imagined, its sharp lines and aggressive stance making it look almost alive. For a brief moment, she hesitated, staring at the machine that had caused so much turmoil in her life. But then her anger surged back, drowning out any lingering doubt. Reaching into her pocket, Karen pulled out a set of keys. She clenched them tightly in her fist, the metal edges biting into her palm as she pressed them against the smooth paint of the Lamborghini's hood. With a deep breath, she dragged the keys across the surface, leaving behind jagged scratches that marred the flawless finish. The sound was sharp and grating, echoing faintly in the stillness of the night. She moved methodically, scratching along the driver's side of the car until she reached the rear fender. By the time she finished, the damage was undeniable. Long, ugly scar running down the side of James's beloved vehicle. When she stepped back to survey her handiwork, a strange mix of satisfaction and guilt washed over her. Part of her felt triumphant, as though she'd finally struck a blow against the arrogance embodied by the car. But another part of her knew she'd crossed a line, one that couldn't easily be undone. Still, Karen convinced herself it was necessary. "He deserves this," she muttered under her breath before hurrying back to her house, careful to avoid being seen. The next morning, James woke up to a sight that made his blood run cold. As he sipped his coffee and glanced out the window, he noticed something off about the Lamborghini. At first he thought it might be a trick of the light or dirt from the road, but when he stepped outside for a closer look, the truth hit him, like a punch to the gut. Deep scratches ran along the driver's side of the car, marring its once pristine surface. His stomach churned as he ran his fingers over the damage, feeling the rough grooves left behind. Someone had deliberately vandalized his car. Furious and shaken, James immediately called the police to file a report. Officers arrived within minutes, taking photos of the scratches and asking questions about possible suspects. When asked if he had any idea who might have done it, James hesitated. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but deep down he suspected Karen. Who else would go to such lengths to punish him for refusing to follow her rules? While the investigation got underway, word of the vandalism spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some residents expressed sympathy for James, shaking their heads at the senselessness of the act. Others whispered among themselves, speculating about who could be responsible. A few even hinted that Karen might be involved, pointing to her history of conflicts with James. But without concrete evidence, nothing could be proven. It wasn't until a neighbor reviewed footage from their Ring camera that the truth came to light. The video showed Karen sneaking out of her house late at night, walking directly to James's driveway and scratching the car with her keys. There was no mistaking her identity. Her distinctive gait and outfit were unmistakable. When confronted by authorities, Karen initially denied involvement, claiming the footage must have been edited or misinterpreted, but the evidence was overwhelming and eventually she admitted to damaging the car. Instead of apologizing, however, Karen doubled down on her behavior. During questioning, she argued that James had brought this on himself by ignoring HOA guidelines and disrupting the neighborhood. She claimed the scratches were a form of protest against his selfishness and lack of consideration for others. While her reasoning sounded absurd to most people, Karen clung to it fiercely, convinced that she was justified in teaching James a lesson. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. Neighbors who had once tolerated Karen's antics now found themselves questioning her judgment. Many were appalled by her willingness to resort to vandalism, while others struggled to reconcile her actions with the image of the friendly, rule-abiding woman they thought they knew. The HOA board, embarrassed by the negative attention, distanced themselves from Karen, issuing a statement condemning her behavior and promising to review their policies to prevent similar incidents in the future. For James, the discovery of Karen's role in the vandalism was both infuriating and validating. On one hand, he was relieved to finally have answers and proof of her involvement. On the other hand, the sheer audacity of her actions left him reeling. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was an attack on his property and his pride. Determined to hold her accountable, James decided to press charges against Karen for criminal mischief. He also hired a lawyer to explore additional legal options, including suing her for damages. As news of the incident spread, the story took on a life of its own. Local media outlets picked up on the drama, dubbing Karen the HOA Hammer, AI, nickname that would stick despite the fact that hammers weren't involved, at least not yet. Reporters flocked to the neighborhood, eager to capture interviews with James, Karen, and anyone else willing to comment. Social media exploded with memes and jokes mocking Karen's behavior, turning her into an unwitting internet sensation. For many outsiders, the situation was equal parts entertaining and baffling. How could someone stoop so low over a car? Meanwhile, Karen retreated into her home, humiliated and defensive. She refused to speak to reporters or acknowledge the growing backlash against her. Inside, she stewed over the injustice of it all, convinced that she was the real victim in this scenario. In her mind, James had provoked her with his stubbornness and refusal to play by the rules. The scratches were merely a way of standing up for what she believed in, even if her methods were extreme. But James wasn't interested in excuses. The damage to his Lamborghini totaled nearly $15,000, a staggering sum that would require significant repairs. More importantly, the emotional toll of the ordeal weighed heavily on him. What should have been a source of joy and pride had become a lightning rod for conflict and stress. He resolved to fight back, not just for himself, but as a message to anyone who thought they could bully others into submission. Little did either of them know, this was far from the end of their feud. While Karen may have thought her key-scratching stunt would teach James a lesson, it only served to fan the flames of resentment. And as tensions continued to rise, the consequences of her actions would spiral far beyond anything she could have anticipated. The fallout from Karen's vandalism only deepened the rift between her and James, turning what had been a simmering feud into an all-out war. When the police investigation confirmed that Karen was responsible for scratching James's Lamborghini, she found herself at the center of a scandal that quickly spiraled out of control. The local news picked up the story, dubbing her the HOA Karen and plastering her face across social media platforms. Memes mocking her actions spread like wildfire, with captions like, "When life gives you lemons, scratch someone else's car," or "Key to success, don't vandalize your neighbor's $200K toy." For Karen, it felt like the entire world was laughing at her expense. At first, Karen tried to downplay the incident, insisting that her actions were justified. During interviews with reporters who camped outside her house, she argued that James had brought the situation on himself by flaunting his wealth and ignoring HOA guidelines. She claimed that her behavior was a form of protest, a last-ditch effort to uphold neighborhood standards after every other option had failed. But her explanations fell flat, coming across as excuses rather than legitimate reasoning. Even some of her closest allies in the HOA began distancing themselves, embarrassed by her antics and worried about how the drama reflected on the community as a whole. For James, the public exposure of Karen's crime was both vindicating and infuriating. On one hand, he felt relieved to finally have concrete evidence proving her guilt. It validated everything he'd suspected about her obsessive vendetta against him. On the other hand, the sheer audacity of her actions left him stunned. Keying. A car worth hundreds of thousands of dollars wasn't just petty, it was malicious. And while the scratches could be repaired, the emotional toll lingered. Every time James looked at his damaged Lamborghini, he saw not just the physical scars, but also the lengths Karen had gone to punish him. Determined to hold her accountable, James decided to take legal action. With the help of a skilled attorney, he filed a lawsuit against Karen, seeking compensation for the cost of repairs as well as punitive damages for emotional distress. His lawyer argued that Karen's actions constituted intentional property damage and harassment, making her liable not only for the immediate financial losses but also for the broader impact on James's quality of life. The case quickly gained traction, drawing even more attention to the already infamous dispute. Local TV stations covered every development, turning the courtroom proceedings into something resembling a reality show. Karen, meanwhile, dug in her heels, refusing to admit fault or apologize. Instead, she launched a counteroffensive, hiring her own lawyer to argue that James had provoked her behavior by ignoring repeated warnings from the HOA. Her defense team painted her as a victim of circumstance, claiming that her actions were a desperate response to James's refusal to respect community rules. They even suggested that James's decision to press charges was excessive and vindictive, accusing him of using the legal system to bully her into submission. As the case unfolded, tensions between the two sides reached a boiling point. Court hearings became heated affairs, with both parties presenting their arguments passionately and sometimes aggressively. James's attorney presented overwhelming evidence of Karen's guilt, including the security footage showing her keying the car and transcripts of her earlier complaints about the Lamborghini. Witnesses testified about her increasingly erratic behavior, describing how she had weaponized the HOA to target James. Meanwhile, Karen's lawyer attempted to cast doubt on the severity of the incident, arguing that the damages were exaggerated and that James's reaction was disproportionate to the offense. Despite Karen's efforts to deflect blame, the judge ultimately sided with James. In a landmark ruling, Karen was ordered to pay $300,000 in restitution, covering not only the cost of repairing the Lamborghini, but also punitive damages intended to deter similar behavior in the future. The verdict sent shockwaves through the community, sparking debates about accountability, personal responsibility, and the limits of authority within homeowner associations. Some residents cheered the outcome, seeing it as a victory for individual rights over oppressive bureaucracy. Others sympathized with Karen, believing that the punishment was too harsh given the circumstances. For Karen, the financial blow was devastating. The judgment far exceeded her ability to pay, forcing her to liquidate assets and dip into savings she had set aside for retirement. Desperate to cover the costs, she listed her home for sale, hoping to find a buyer willing to overlook the stigma now attached to her address. But potential buyers were scarce, deterred by the negative publicity surrounding the neighborhood and Karen's tarnished reputation. Eventually, she was forced to accept a lowball offer, leaving her financially crippled and emotionally drained. The stress of the lawsuit took its toll on Karen's personal life as well. Her marriage, already strained by years of tension and conflict, crumbled under the weight of the scandal. Her husband, tired of defending her actions and dealing with the fallout, filed for divorce shortly after the trial ended. Friends and acquaintances distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with someone whose name had become synonymous with pettiness and vindictiveness. Isolated and humiliated, Karen retreated from public life, spending most of her days holed up in her new apartment, scrolling through online forums where strangers continued to ridicule her. James, on the other hand, emerged from the ordeal stronger and more determined than ever. While the experience had been stressful and emotionally taxing, it also reinforced his belief in standing up for himself and fighting back against injustice. He used part of the settlement money to restore his Lamborghini to its former glory, ensuring that every scratch and blemish was meticulously repaired. The car came back looking better than ever, a symbol of resilience and perseverance. But James didn't stop there. Inspired by the support he received from friends, neighbors, and even strangers who followed his story online, he became an advocate for homeowners' rights. He started attending HOA meetings again, not to argue with Karen, who was no longer involved, but to push for reforms aimed at preventing similar disputes in the future. He proposed changes to the association's bylaws, advocating for clearer guidelines and greater transparency in decision-making processes. To everyone's surprise, many of his suggestions were adopted, leading to a more inclusive and cooperative community atmosphere. Still, James couldn't shake the memory of Karen's relentless campaign against him. Late at night, as he sat in his living room reflecting on everything that had happened, he often wondered what drove someone to such extremes. Was it jealousy? Boredom? A need for control? Whatever the reason, he knew one thing for certain. Karen's actions had taught him a valuable lesson about human nature, and about the importance of staying true to oneself, even in the face of adversity. As weeks turned into months, the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. The drama surrounding the Lamborghini faded from headlines, replaced by newer stories vying for public attention. Life went on, as it always does. But for those who lived through the saga, the lessons remained fresh. For James, it was a reminder that standing your ground can lead to unexpected victories. For Karen, it was a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked entitlement and bitterness. And for the rest of the community, it was a wake-up call, a chance to reflect on the values they wanted to uphold and the kind of environment they hoped to create for themselves and their families. Little did anyone realize, however, that Karen's story was far from over. Though defeated and disgraced, she still harbored resentment toward James and his Lamborghini. Deep down, she believed that she had been wronged, that the court's decision was unfair and that James had somehow manipulated the system to punish her. These feelings festered in silence, growing darker and more toxic with each passing day. Unbeknownst to anyone, Karen was plotting her next move, a final act of revenge that would escalate the feud to unimaginable heights. The courtroom victory should have marked the end of James's nightmare, but deep down he couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't done. Her public humiliation and financial ruin might have silenced her temporarily, but anyone who knew her could see the fire still burning in her eyes. Defeat hadn't extinguished her anger. It had only fueled it. For Karen, losing the lawsuit wasn't just a legal setback. It was a personal affront to everything she believed in. To her, James wasn't just a neighbor with a fancy car. He was a symbol of everything wrong with the world: arrogance, entitlement, and disregard for others. And as far as she was concerned, the battle was far from over. Karen's life, after the trial, was unrecognizable. Once a respected, if controversial, figure in the neighborhood, she now lived in near isolation. Her days were spent scrolling through news articles about the case, reading comments from strangers who mocked her behavior. Some called her Hammer Karen, while others labeled her a cautionary tale of unchecked bitterness. The memes mocking her refusal to let go of her vendetta against James continued to circulate online, ensuring that her shame remained fresh in the public consciousness. Every laugh at her expense felt like another nail in the coffin of her dignity. But instead of reflecting on her actions or seeking redemption, Karen doubled down on her resentment. She convinced herself that James had manipulated the system to punish her unfairly. In her mind, the court ruling wasn't justice, it was revenge disguised as law. The more she replayed the events in her head, the more certain she became that James deserved to suffer just as much as she had. It wasn't enough that he'd won the case and humiliated her publicly. She wanted to make him feel the same pain, the same helplessness that she had endured. Revenge consumed her thoughts, becoming an obsession she couldn't escape. One evening, while sitting alone in her dimly lit apartment, Karen hatched a plan. She knew James worked long hours and often stayed out late celebrating promotions or attending networking events. On those nights, his precious Lamborghini sat unattended in the driveway, a sitting duck. The scratches she'd left before had been satisfying, but they hadn't accomplished what she truly wanted: complete destruction. This time, she wouldn't settle for superficial damage. No, this time, she would leave a mark so devastating that James would never recover. The next day, Karen visited a hardware store under the pretense of buying tools for home repairs. In reality, she purchased a small hammer, one sturdy enough to shatter glass but light enough to carry discreetly. As she paid for the item, the cashier joked about how useful hammers could be for DIY projects. Karen forced a smile, clutching the bag tightly as she walked out of the store. She didn't respond to the comment, too focused on the task ahead to engage in idle chatter. That night, Karen waited until well past midnight before making her move. Dressed in dark clothing to blend into the shadows, she crept across the cul-de-sac toward James's house. Her heart pounded in her chest, each step feeling heavier than the last. For a moment, doubt flickered in her mind. What if someone saw her? What if she got caught? But then she remembered the smug look on James's face during the trial, the way he'd refused to show any remorse or regret. Those memories reignited her anger, pushing aside fear and hesitation. By the time she reached his driveway, her resolve was ironclad. Standing in front of the Lamborghini, Karen hesitated briefly. Even in the dim glow of the streetlights, the car looked breathtaking, its sleek curves and polished finish gleaming, despite the scratches she'd inflicted earlier. For a split second, she allowed herself to admire its beauty, wondering how something so extravagant could exist in their otherwise ordinary neighborhood. Then she reminded herself why she was there. This wasn't just a car, it was a monument to James's selfishness, a constant reminder of everything she despised. Gripping the hammer tightly in her hand, she raised it high above her head and brought it crashing down onto the windshield. The sound was deafening, a sharp crack followed by the tinkling of shattered glass raining onto the pavement. Startled by the noise, Karen froze for a moment, glancing around nervously to ensure no one had heard. When the street remained silent, she continued her assault, smashing every window in sight. Each blow sent shards flying, leaving jagged holes where once there had been pristine glass. She moved methodically, working her way around the car until not a single pane remained intact. By the time she finished, the Lamborghini looked like a shell of its former self, a wrecked, hollowed-out version of the masterpiece it had been just hours earlier. Breathing heavily, Karen stepped back to survey her handiwork. The sight of the ruined car filled her with a twisted sense of satisfaction. Finally, she thought, James would understand what it felt like to lose something precious. Finally, he would know the pain of having something beautiful reduced to rubble. With one last glance at the wreckage, she slipped away into the night, careful to avoid detection. The next morning, James woke up to a scene straight out of a nightmare. As he stepped outside to fetch the newspaper, he froze in horror at the sight of his beloved Lamborghini. The once gleaming supercar was barely recognizable, its windows shattered and interior exposed to the elements. Glass littered the driveway, glinting cruelly in the morning sunlight. For a moment, James couldn't process what he was seeing. His mind raced, trying to piece together how this could have happened. Had vandals targeted him randomly, or was this another calculated attack? It didn't take long for suspicion to fall squarely on Karen. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's security camera confirmed his worst fears. The video showed Karen sneaking into his driveway late at night, hammer in hand, and systematically destroying the car. There was no mistaking her identity. The grainy footage captured her unmistakable posture and gait. Unlike the first incident with the key scratches, there was no room for denial this time. The evidence was damning, leaving no doubt about who was responsible. When confronted by authorities, Karen initially tried to deny involvement, claiming the footage must have been altered or taken out of context. But when presented with irrefutable proof, she broke down, confessing to the crime in a fit of rage. "He deserved it," she shouted during questioning, her voice trembling with emotion. "He thinks he's better than everyone else because of that stupid car. Well, now he knows what it feels like to lose something you care about." Her words shocked even the most hardened detectives. Vandalism was one thing, but this level of premeditated destruction bordered on pathological. While some neighbors expressed sympathy for Karen's struggles, others were appalled by her lack of remorse. How could someone justify such extreme behavior? The consensus among most residents was clear. Karen had gone too far this time. For James, the discovery of Karen's latest act of vengeance was both infuriating and heartbreaking. He stared at the wreckage of his car, struggling to comprehend how someone could harbor so much hatred. The cost of repairs would run into tens of thousands of dollars, not to mention the emotional toll of having his prized possession destroyed, twice. But more than anything, he felt a profound sense of sadness. Sadness not just for himself, but for Karen. How could someone become so consumed by bitterness that they resorted to such destructive behavior? Determined to put an end to the madness once and for all, James decided to escalate the matter further. He filed additional charges against Karen, including felony vandalism and trespassing. This time, there was no question about her guilt. The evidence was overwhelming. Facing mounting legal fees and the possibility of jail time, Karen found herself backed into a corner with nowhere left to hide. Her attempts to paint herself as a victim fell flat, overshadowed by the sheer scale of her crimes. As the investigation unfolded, the community grappled with the aftermath of Karen's actions. Neighbors who had once tolerated her eccentricities now viewed her with suspicion and distrust. Parents warned their children to steer clear of her, fearing that her instability might manifest in other ways. Even the HOA board, which had distanced itself from her earlier, issued a formal statement condemning her behavior and pledging to support any legal action taken against her. For Karen, the consequences of her actions were catastrophic. Already, financially crippled by the previous lawsuit, she now faced even steeper penalties for her latest offense. The prospect of prison loomed large, adding to the weight of her despair. Friends and family abandoned her, unwilling to associate with someone whose name had become synonymous with chaos and destruction. Alone and defeated, Karen retreated further into isolation, consumed by regret and self-loathing. Meanwhile, James began the painstaking process of repairing his Lamborghini. While the physical damage could be fixed, the emotional scars ran deeper. He couldn't help but wonder how someone could let hatred fester to the point of ruining their own life and the lives of those around them. Still, he refused to let Karen's actions define him. Instead, he channeled his energy into rebuilding, not just his car, but his sense of purpose. If anything, the ordeal had strengthened his resolve to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. Little did either of them realize, however, that the story was far from over. While Karen's rampage may have marked the climax of their feud,